Chapter 35. A Conquest of Hearts. History books relate the events which led to the surrender of Makkah to the Prophet in a chapter entitled The Conquest of Makkah. The word conquest suggests a hard military battle, yet there was very little fighting to speak of in that particular conquest. Indeed, it is more appropriate to speak of the conquest of the people of Makkah. That was the real objective of the campaign. What that campaign achieved was unparalleled in history. The story was that of the homecoming of a person who was rejected by his own people, driven out of his hometown with a rich reward on his head, but was able to flee and establish a base elsewhere. He then acquired power and moved gradually to a position of overall supremacy in the land surrounding the area from which he was driven out. Would not that person entertain visions of what sort of vengeance he would finally inflict on those who drove him out of his hometown once they had fallen into his hands? History books are full of reports and stories of atrocities committed by conquerors after subjugating their old enemies. Such atrocities were never the monopoly of one race of humankind in any period. The process begins immediately after victory has been achieved. A period of lawlessness in which everything of value is looted. Killings, rape, and theft become perfectly acceptable when committed by the victors. Summary execution of war criminals. Courts formed for war crimes committed by the vanquished, but not by the victor. The list is endless. The ferocity of all such actions is much greater when personal grudges are involved. Yet the idea of vengeance was far from the Prophet's mind. Indeed, his thoughts moved in the opposite direction. He was thinking hard about how to reduce casualties, how to preserve the lives of the people of Makkah, and how to achieve victory without bloodshed. 2 years earlier, when the Prophet and his companions had tried to visit Makkah for offering an umrah, and when he had realized that the Quraysh were not going to allow him inside Makkah, he had declared his readiness to accept any formula which ensured that no blood was shed. One would have thought, however, that the fact that the Quraysh violated the peace agreement which was made between the two sides at Al-Hudaybiyah would have exhausted the patience of the Prophet and his companions to the extent that they would be in no mood to forgive the Quraysh's treachery. The Prophet was not a person to leave matters unresolved when they called for decisive action. He would not overlook hostile actions if that would result in giving the enemy a feeling that the Muslims were weak. Nor would he resort to the use of force where a kind gesture would be sure to bring better results. Hence, the Prophet was certain that the Quraysh should be brought face to face with the consequences of their treachery. The price they would be made to pay, however, would depend on how they viewed that price in that particular situation. Avoiding bloodshed. One thing which was abundantly clear right from the start was that the Prophet wanted to avoid bloodshed as much as he could. As his army began to prepare, he prayed God to enable him to take the Quraysh by surprise in their own land. The purpose of that prayer was not the launching of a surprise attack which would have resulted in mass killings among the Quraysh in return for very few casualties among the Muslims. Rather, the Prophet wanted to face the Quraysh with a situation in which they would feel themselves no match for him. In such a situation, they might choose not to put up any resistance, and victory for the Muslims would be achieved without bloodshed. This was abundantly clear when Abu Sufyan, the Quraysh's leader, was brought to the Prophet. Had Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, been an ordinary commander or leader of any victorious army or nation, Abu Sufyan would have paid dearly for his past hostility to the cause of Islam, which had cost the Muslims over the years many martyrs and several war campaigns. Instead, Abu Sufyan was pardoned and sent back to his people with a position of honor. His house was made a haven of safety for anyone who wished to stay there. When the Prophet heard that one of his commanders, Sa'd ibn Ubadah, was threatening revenge, he replaced him with his son. He made it absolutely clear to all his commanders and his soldiers that they were not to fight unless attacked. But who were those people whose lives the Prophet was keen to spare? They were indeed the very people who turned him out of their city after repeatedly plotting to destroy his life. When he called on them to believe in God, they answered, as the Quran tells us, "Our hearts are insulated against what you are calling on us to believe in. Our ears are sealed, and a heavy curtain is drawn between you and us." They stopped at nothing in their hostility to him personally and to his cause. They accused him of being a liar, a sorcerer, and a madman. They schemed against him and urged others to be hostile to him and to his companions. They forged alliances to meet his peaceful call with the force of arms. When he gained complete victory and all of them were at his mercy, he was much more merciful to them than they dared hope. At the height of his victory, the Prophet did not forget for a single moment the fact that he was a prophet and that his message came first. Those very people were there to be won over to the cause of Islam, and that was his top priority. What could win them over more than a general pardon, which he readily gave? All that was required of anyone to be safe was to stay at home. Even the most hostile, even those individuals whom the Prophet sentenced to death in any circumstances were not killed. Any one of them who came to him in any way, regretting his earlier misdeeds, was given a free pardon. One must not forget that those people were sentenced to death because they had committed unpardonable crimes. But in spite of those crimes, a pardon was not difficult to arrange once they showed their willingness to live with the new situation. To appreciate the attitude of the Prophet fully, it is worth reflecting on the following incident. As the Prophet was going round the Kaaba in his tawaf, a man from the Quraysh called Fudala ibn Umar was watching him with a burning grudge in his heart. He thought to himself, "Why do I not kill Muhammad, peace be upon him, now that he feels safe? I do not care what happens to me afterwards if I can avenge our defeat." With this thought in mind, Fudala maneuvered himself into a position which enabled him to walk right behind the Prophet. The Prophet suddenly turned to him and said, "Is that Fudala?" The man answered, "Yes, it is Fudala, Messenger of God." The Prophet asked him again, "What have you been saying to yourself?" Fudala answered, "Nothing, I was only praising God." The Prophet laughed and said, "Seek God's forgiveness." He put his hand on Fudala's chest and pressed it a little until he calmed down. Fudala used to say later, "I swear by God that when he lifted his hand off my chest, there was no one on earth dearer to me than he was." Apparently, Fudala used to be a playboy. On the way home, he passed a woman with whom he had an illegitimate relationship. She invited him in, but he refused and told her that he was now a Muslim. He accepted the faith and believed in God alone and renounced idolatrous worship. This symbolizes the Prophet's attitude. It was an attitude based on giving a complete, total pardon, which erased all hostilities and all bad feelings. In this way, the Prophet won over the hearts of the Quraysh. It was only a matter of hours or days before they started to declare their acceptance of Islam. The maxim on which the Prophet's attitude was based is best expressed by the Quranic verse, "A good deed and a bad one can never be alike. Repel the latter with the one which is best, and you will find that the person with whom you have a long hostility behaving to you as an intimate friend." 41:34. The Prophet's attitude pulled down all those barriers which stood between the Quraysh and Islam. The conquest of the hearts of the Quraysh was absolutely complete. Every individual is important. The Prophet was very eager to win every heart in Mecca. As already seen, he pardoned the majority of those people whom he had earlier sentenced to death for their unpardonable crimes. Indeed, he was keen to win over the very person who was contemplating his assassination. The Prophet's actions in Mecca suggest that he would have been prepared to sit with every individual to explain the message of Islam to him personally and show him the benefits of Islamic life. No military commander in the position of the Prophet at the moment of his complete victory over his most hostile enemy would have bothered himself about what might have happened to any individual soldier, officer, or commander of the enemy army. But the Prophet cared for every single one because he treated them as human beings to whom God's message was addressed. Safwan ibn Umayyah was one of the young generation of the Quraysh leaders. He was head of the clan of Jumah. He nursed a deep grudge against the Prophet and the Muslims. At the Battle of Badr, Safwan had lost his father and brother. At the Battle of Uhud, he had lost his uncle. In order to have a good idea of how Safwan felt his losses and nursed his grudges, it may be useful to remind ourselves of an incident which took place shortly after the Battle of Badr and which was related fully in its appropriate place, chapter 18. Safwan sat down with an intimate friend of his called Umar ibn Wahab, speaking of their bereavement and mourning those who were killed at Badr. Umar, a young man full of enthusiasm, said to Safwan, "Had it not been for the fact that I have young children who have no one to support them if I am killed, and the fact that I am heavily in debt, I would have gone to Medina and killed Muhammad, peace be upon him. I have a good pretext to go near him. I have a brother whom the Muslims have taken prisoner, and I would pretend that I want to negotiate his ransom." Safwan jumped at the chance of having Muhammad, peace be upon him, killed in revenge for his father and brother. He pledged his word of honor to Umar that he would settle all his debts and look after his children as if they were his own if Umar would go to Medina and try to kill Muhammad, peace be upon him. This was all agreed in absolute secrecy. Carrying out his plan, Umar was in Medina in a few days, entering the mosque to meet the Prophet. When he mentioned his pretext for being there, the Prophet related to him word for word his secret conversation with Safwan. Umar was overwhelmed and declared that no one but a messenger from God could have known his secret. He accepted Islam, remained in Medina, and fought with the Muslims in all subsequent major battles. Needless to say, Safwan was more than furious when he heard of his friend's conversion to Islam. Umar continued to wish his old friend well. When the Muslim army entered Mecca, his thoughts went to Safwan, whom he hoped to find in a state of mind which would help him accept Islam. He was soon to be disappointed. When he inquired about his friend, he was told that he had made his way to Jeddah, where he planned to take a boat to Yemen. At that time, the Arabs viewed traveling by sea as extremely dangerous, but what was more dangerous for Safwan, in Umar's view, was to remain hostile to Islam and to allow his personal grudges to blind him to its truth. Umar felt that he had to do his utmost to save his friend. He went straight to the Prophet and said, "Messenger of God, Safwan ibn Umayyah is the chief of his clan. He has fled to save himself from you. However, he plans to risk himself in the sea. Could you please give me a guarantee of his safety? May God shower his blessings on you?" The Prophet granted Umar his request. Umar then asked him for a sign which he could give to Safwan as a guarantee of his safety, and the Prophet gave him his own turban, which he had on his head at the time when he entered Mecca. Traveling at full speed, Umar managed to catch up with Safwan just as he was boarding a boat. He spoke to him passionately. "Safwan, may both my parents be sacrificed for your sake." This was a phrase of endearment which was not meant literally. "Take care before you kill yourself. I have brought you a guarantee of safety from God's messenger." Safwan spoke in a defiant manner. "Leave me alone and do not speak to me, you liar." Umar, however, was not to be deterred. He continued with his passionate appeal. "Safwan, I have come here after I have spoken to the man who is the best, the kindest, the most gracious, and the most benevolent of all people. He is your cousin. You know you can share in his honor, power, and kingdom." Needless to say, Umar was appealing to those feelings which are paramount in the mind of any noble Arab who had not yet accepted the message of Islam. Safwan relented a little and said, "I fear for my life." Umar reassured him, "He is much too kind and clement to all people for you to fear for your life." Realizing that traveling to Yemen did not offer him any great prospects, and sensing the truth in what Umar had said, and that he truly had his interest at heart, Safwan was persuaded that it was far better for him to go back with his old friend. Umar took him straight to the Prophet. After Umar had greeted the Prophet, Safwan said, "This man claims that you have guaranteed my safety." The Prophet answered, "He is telling the truth." Safwan said, "Allow me then a period of 2 months to think my position over." The Prophet replied, "You have 4 months to think it over and make your own free choice." Thus, Safwan ibn Umayyah was free to go about Mecca in absolute safety and under no obligation to join Islam. This was a personal gesture by the Prophet to let a sensible man make his own free choice. How this treatment was instrumental in winning Safwan over to Islam will be illustrated later. Mecca, the solid base for Islam. The Prophet's attitude towards such individual cases was appropriate to the overall objective he had set for himself. With regard to Mecca, namely, that Mecca should become a solid base of Islam, the changeover was to be complete. The city which housed the most ancient temple built for worshipping God alone must always remain a cornerstone in the structure of Islam and a base in which Muslims would always enjoy total security. For Makkah to be a Muslim city was to establish a strong link between Islam and former divine religions and to make this link felt by every Muslim in every age. On the other hand, for Makkah to remain an un-Islamic city was unthinkable. The Prophet was, therefore, working for a definite and most honorable aim. Moreover, he realized that God wanted him to win Makkah over rather than to defeat the Quraysh in a military confrontation. It is generally agreed by Muslim scholars that 2 years earlier, at the time when the Prophet concluded the peace agreement at Al-Hudaybiyah, he was acting on clear and direct instructions from God. For a certainty, God told the Muslims shortly after the peace agreement was concluded, against the express wishes of most of them, that had there been a confrontation between them and the unbelievers of Makkah, they would certainly have scored a remarkable victory. In the surah which comments on the events of Al-Hudaybiyah, God says, "Had the unbelievers fought against you, they would indeed have turned their backs in flight and would have found none to protect them and none to bring them succor." 48:22. What this meant in effect was that God was able to bring about the fall of Makkah into the hands of the Muslims 2 years earlier. All that was required was for the Prophet and the Muslims to stick to their rightful demands to be allowed to worship at the Kaaba. The Quraysh was bound to prevent them, and an armed clash would then have been inevitable. That would have resulted, as God clearly states, in a total defeat for the Makkans. Nevertheless, God preferred to leave the unbelievers to rule in Makkah for another 2 years in order to bring about a far better result. Considering these events with hindsight, one can appreciate the great wisdom which accompanied the Prophet's actions at Al-Hudaybiyah and subsequently until the fall of Makkah into the hands of the Muslims. Had there been a military confrontation 2 years earlier, it would have left too many grudges for any real peace to be established between the Quraysh and the Muslims. Such a conquest would have been a conquest of a city, but not a conquest of hearts. What the Prophet achieved 2 years later was a conquest which brought about the total transformation of Makkah, from a city which was profoundly hostile to Islam to the city which has continued to be ever since and will continue to be forever the solid base of Islam. That sort of victory could have been achieved only with the remarkable attitude shown by the Prophet to his old enemies, an attitude of clemency, love, mercy, and a profound desire to show these old enemies the way to their own happiness. No ordinary human being could have behaved in such a manner at such a time, after such a long history of hostility. Muhammad, peace be upon him, was able to do so because he was God's messenger and prophet. Substituting love for hostility. To have a complete picture of what happened in those days in Makkah, it is important to consider how effective the Prophet's method was in achieving his purpose of winning the hearts of his former enemies. For the previous 20 years or so, no one in Makkah, not even the most hostile and sworn enemy of Islam, could have denied that the Prophet treated all people with kindness and was keen to replace any hostility any person harbored towards Islam with friendship and loyalty. It was equally true, however, that no one could have dreamed that the Prophet would have extended such a measure of unparalleled kind treatment to the people of Makkah. For 20 years, those people had nurtured an unabating hostility towards Islam, making every effort to suppress it and plotting time after time to kill the Prophet. For them to be pardoned en masse was beyond their wildest dreams. They certainly hoped that Muhammad, peace be upon him, would not scourge them with his vengeance, but that he spared their lives, guaranteed their safety, protected their properties, and loved their children was far more than they had dared hope. What the Prophet's treatment achieved was an instant change of attitude by every person in Makkah. Worry and fear for their own lives, families, and children disappeared to be replaced by a new look at Islam. It was not to be expected that people would immediately forget their past hostility, but it was reasonable to expect them to ask themselves, how did Islam change those Arabs who responded to the call of the Prophet? How did they achieve such an unparalleled degree of discipline? How did they attach greater value to enforcing the commands of the Prophet than to looting a wealthy city which had fallen to them after a long history of hostility? The people of Makkah looked at the Muslims as they prayed in congregation and admired their discipline and their dedication. They looked at the new bonds which Islam had cemented within the Muslim community and realized that pure love, for God's sake, was the bond which replaced all past loyalties in order to forge out of those Arab tribes a single community, united by its dedication to the cause of Islam. Moreover, the people of Makkah were able to listen to the Quran and consider the meaning of its verses objectively for the first time in their history. In the past, they used to make fun of the Quran and told one another not to listen to it. Now that they were free from those chains which had restricted their thinking and fettered their minds, they were able to appreciate how profound and sublime the faith of Islam was in comparison to their pagan beliefs, which made them worship idols made of stone and gold. The influence of a unique example. One can imagine that a great debate was taking place in the homes and meeting places of the Quraysh people in the days following the fall of their city to the Prophet. Those of the Quraysh leaders who were able to detach themselves from their past hostility to Islam and to look at it in the new light offered to them were quick to see that the best way to remedy their past wrong was to accept Islam and join the new call which was promising to change the whole world. Those who had relatives or friends among the Muslims, especially those of the Quraysh who had emigrated with the Prophet, were also in contact with them and were able to learn more about Islam. Hence, many people started to come to the Prophet to declare their adoption of Islam. It was an individual process at first, but in a few days the majority of the people of Makkah wanted to become Muslims. The Prophet therefore sat at the hill of Al-Safa near the Kaaba to accept their pledges of embracing Islam. Beneath him, Umar ibn al-Khattab was accepting the pledges of the Makkah people on behalf of the Prophet. They pledged to obey God and the Prophet as best as they could. No one was forced to come, but people realized that they had been in the wrong for too long, and that the wise course was for them to acknowledge their mistake and make amends. Some people wanted their pledges of loyalty to include a covenant to emigrate from Makkah in order to join the Prophet. Mujashi ibn Masud, one of the Muhajirin, brought his brother Mujalid to the Prophet and said, "Messenger of God, I have brought my brother so that you will accept his pledge to emigrate with the Muhajirin." The Prophet answered, "Emigration is now a thing of the past. Those who have emigrated, that is the Muhajirin, have taken all its reward." Mujashi asked him, "What sort of pledge would you then accept from him?" He said, "I accept his pledge to embrace Islam, to be a true believer, and to struggle for the cause of God." The Prophet made it clear to the people of Makkah that those who had emigrated with him, that is, the Muhajirin, achieved a standard which could not be achieved by anyone else. They had left their hometown in support of their faith when the cause of Islam was weak and threatened on all sides. Now that Islam was strong and people were joining it in large numbers every day, it was not possible for any new Muslim to achieve that standard. However, people could struggle and work hard for their faith so that more people might come to know of it and accept it. When the Prophet had accepted the pledges of the men of Makkah to follow Islam, he met the Meccan women and accepted their pledges. The pledges of the women were a little more detailed. They had to pledge not to ascribe divinity to anyone other than God, not to steal or commit adultery, not to kill their children, and not to claim falsely that a child belongs to a certain father when it does not, and not to disobey the Prophet in anything reasonable he orders them. In order to appreciate how relaxed the atmosphere in Makkah was when the Prophet accepted those pledges, and to be certain that these pledges were given freely without any degree of coercion, one can quote this incident. Hind bint Utbah was the wife of Abu Sufyan, the leader of Makkah. She was a passionate woman who nurtured unabated grudges against the Prophet and the Muslims. She had lost her father and brother in the Battle of Badr, and took revenge by arranging the killing of the Prophet's uncle at the Battle of Uhud. When he was killed, she disfigured him, opened his stomach, took out his liver, and tried to eat it raw. Now she came to the Prophet to pledge her loyalty to Islam. However, she hid her face so that he would not recognize her. She feared that he might want to avenge his uncle's death. Nevertheless, the atmosphere was relaxed, and she was able to comment on every item in the pledge required of women. When the Prophet said to the Meccan women, "Pledge to me that you will not ascribe divinity to anyone other than God," Hind said, "You are certainly asking us to give you more than you asked the men." He continued, "And not to steal." Hind said, "I used to take some money from Abu Sufyan little by little behind his back. I did not know whether that was permissible or not. Abu Sufyan, her husband, who was present, said, "Whatever you have taken in the past is yours." The Prophet said, "Then you are Hind bint Utbah." She answered, "Yes, indeed. Forgive the past. May God forgive you." The Prophet continued outlining the terms of the pledge, and not to commit adultery. Hind said, "Messenger of God, would an honorable woman be an adulteress?" When the Prophet mentioned the next item of the pledge, and not to kill your children, she said, "We reared them from when they were young until they grew up, and then you and your companions killed them at Badr." Umar ibn Khattab chuckled merrily at this comment. The Prophet then continued with the other terms of the pledge and instructed Umar to accept their pledges. The Prophet never shook hands with a woman who was not his wife or a member of his immediate family. The Prophet stayed nearly 20 days in Mecca, setting its affairs on a proper Islamic course. He wanted the city's change of character to be complete. He also took care to remove all appearances of idolatry from every place in Mecca. Already mentioned is the fact that he ordered the removal of all the idols in and around the Kaaba. Now, he ordered that no one in Mecca should keep an idol in his home. It was the habit of the people of Mecca to have in their homes idols which they would touch whenever they went out or came back seeking their blessings. The people of Mecca carried out that order and all idols were broken. Hind bint Utbah took an axe with which to break her idol. As she did so, she said, "We were deceived by you." The Prophet also sent several expeditions to the surrounding area to remove and break all the idols. Khalid ibn al-Walid was dispatched at the head of a detachment of 30 horsemen to the valley of Nakhla to destroy the idol known as Al-Uzza, the largest idol in the whole district. Khalid carried out the Prophet's orders and destroyed the home where the idol was kept. Its custodian was shouting at the top of his voice, "Al-Uzza, show them your anger." But Al-Uzza was nothing more than a statue. Amr ibn al-As was sent with a detachment of Muslim forces to Hudail, where he destroyed its idol Suva. Its guard asked Amr when he saw him approaching, "What do you want?" Amr told him that he wanted to destroy Suva, and the guardian tried to persuade him not to do so for his own safety. Amr said to him, "You are still as ignorant as ever." Sa'id ibn Zayd was sent to destroy another main idol, Manat, which was worshipped by the tribes of Medina before they became Muslims. Thus, the marks of idolatry were removed from Mecca and the surrounding area, and the majority of the people of Mecca became Muslims. The Quraysh had been the main tribe standing firm against Islam. Now that it had surrendered, would the forces hostile to Islam accept the Quraysh's defeat as their own? Or would they try to group and marshal their forces in order to stop the tide of Islam?